So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Anuradha Kapur, who's a theatre director, a scholar, and a professor in theatre arts, and the present director of the National School of Drama. Anuradha, it is the first time you formally coming to CC.
Informally was the first time.
Oh, I see. Okay. I'm very glad actually to make it, because I know that how busy you are. Because Anuradha is very much part of the structuring of the CC, and is very happy to see you here, finally. Today, Dr. Kapur is going to talk about Promenade Theatre, the spatial configuration of Promenade, in fact, how that actually changed the experience of a spectator to actually take a journey through the spaces. Anuradha is a director who has been in the field for many years, more than 30 years, who inspired many directors, including me. I have looked at Anuradha's work for many years, very closely looked at her work, and I had finally we had a chance actually to collaborate recently, so we did a work together a few months ago, Jekyll and Hyde, which was a Promenade performance, and I'm aware that she's going to talk about that as well today, the kind of process of evolving a space of performance and the spectators. In addition to that, I personally would like to actually hear your view on the kind of experimental theatre you actually stand for. Because not many senior directors like you out there who actually continue to experiment to perform. And maybe because of that, very recently they criticized many traditionalists and many modernists for the way I use breathing. The people like me and many contemporary directors who actually keep experimenting and producing alternative theatre. So it would be really nice to see the kind of stand you are actually taking. So I welcome you.
I think many of us have been not sure how I should do this. When I go to the media, then I leave this. Many of us have actually been in some sort of discussion about contemporary theatre work over many years. We've also had an opportunity, my generation of people, to collaborate with each other, and I've Nirima Sheikh, who my group Vivadi and myself have had an opportunity to collaborate over many years, is here. So it's a very special occasion, partly because I think that long time collaborations in the theatre between various kinds of disciplines has had a long history, but it hasn't been very rich. There are not many collaborations have taken place that have actually tried to question some of the dominant modes of making theatre. So I'll start from there, that questions of spectatorship and what spectatorship is in the theatre has been very much a part of debate from the 1970s onwards. It's 1970s marked particularly because it's across the world that certain forms of viewing and for certain forms of experiencing theatre came to be questioned. But what has actually now, one can crystallize the words to say that the question is constantly about how to position the audience in a way that questions the dominance or the dominant mode in which the spectator is both disembodied and atemporal. So most of the work, let us say, of Promenade Theatre or work that is actually looking at proscenium theatre tries to work this out. How to make the spectator embodied and temporal. I will look at this thing, at these series of ideas towards the end of my presentation to you. But the basic question that seems to be asked again and again is how, in fact, do we fracture the habit of expecting the theatre to give you a God's eye view, a kind of Olympian eye view, which is part of the proscenium theatre and its perspectival ambitions. So if one were to think about it, then we should say that somewhere or the other, we find ways of making, as I said, the spectator embodied as well as temporal, and finding a way that the narrative that the spectator views has also some connection to that. So we would say perhaps that the proscenium arch has given rise to a certain kind of narrative structure, which I will talk about in a moment, but the narrative structure clearly is an escalating narrative structure, a narrative structure that has now classically got the 3 to 5 act structure and ends with recognition or ends with a revelation. However, the main thing is that there is a denouement and there is an escalation. Perhaps the questioning of this kind of spectatorship experience would mean that a certain kind of experience is put in place which is both episodic and movement orientated, ambulatory, so that the bodies that you see on stage in action also affect you to action. And this is something that, philosophically we have the emancipated spectator saying in that Trotsky says very clearly, somehow or the other we have to find a way of moving that body that looks at you, because you too are a moving body and the connection between the two has to be set up. But these are things that I would like to just put before you. So my presentation to you is divided in 3. One, we look at the way cognition in terms of how viewing gives us opportunities to change. Second would be some of the ways that Promenade Theatre has functioned. One of them, most famous, is the Ramlila at Ramnagar. And lastly, I will present before you some of the images of the work that Deepan and I did in collaboration a few months ago. So what is the basic point that I think we should begin with, or I should present to you, is how to mobilize the spectator. There is an emotional mobility in the spectator. There is an emotional journey in the spectator. In fact, emotional journey is the key word of Stanislavskian theatre. It is also the key word of naturalist theatre, which says it must present a journey. Now, the nature of the journey has to be, I think, thought of so that we can actually rethink the way that we make stories. One of the things that the proscenium arch theatre has actually made us experience and therefore believe is that there are no changing rules of spectatorship. And in fact, I think what we need to remember that spectatorship is a selective process, and rules change according to the architecture of the space, of course, but rules change, as I said, according to narrative, and also rules change according to the way you would want to present difficulty, fallibility, and problems of viewing within the experience of the theatre. When I say rules change, I mean it's just very, just as glancingly, the Greek landscape and the Greek theatre, for instance, is primarily based on the oral and the mnemonic aspect of theatre. In other words, if you have a 70-foot entrance for an actor, which is what it is, you have a 70-foot entrance to the central stage for an actor, then that 70-foot, you have a gaze that travels 70 foot. Now, in terms of performance, as we all know, that 70 foot cannot happen in quiet, without saying anything. So written into the Greek theatre is repetition. Here comes Tiresias, says one person, here comes Tiresias, says the chorus, here comes Tiresias, says the messenger. So in those three repetitions, you have covered 70 foot. In other words, the 70 foot is written into the text. And that would be something that we should remember, because spectatorship is actually defining the social relationship in the theatre. For instance, we also forget, again in our restagings of Shakespeare, that Shakespeare in fact then has a theatre which is a leveling theatre. It has, it's seating about 1200 people, but in fact, except for a very small area that's kept up for royalty, the theatre is actually invigorated by the presence of the pit, where the first line, the first row of audience stands with their elbows at the edge of the theatre. In other words, the soliloquy that's played downstage is played right here to me. So this interesting 19th century understanding of theatre, of Shakespeare, which says the Shakespearean soliloquy is meant for the royalty and the Shakespearean burlesque or risque humor is meant for the pit, is completely blown apart, because the relationship of the pit and the performer is what is setting the performance of Shakespeare in position. So, through this sort of visuality, we also know that the Shakespearean audience hooted, ate, cheered, booed all the way through. So the notion of a behavior in the auditorium is also written in. As we know, Shakespearean performances till very late had no rehearsal, that the actors just had the cue line, and the cue line was the key to listening. And when you listen to your text, the cue line you performed, and in the performance or in the speech was the instruction which you then did. So there is a little miss of beat between performance and reading. In other words, so we have Romeo saying, "I wish I was the glove upon thy hand," and she hears it and she does it. So the entire way of performance is coming through the ear, in which you can then actually amplify that performance. Here again, therefore, I am saying that the auditorium, the relationship of noise, sound, participation is actually producing a certain kind of experience that we now tend to forget about the Shakespearean performance. And then as we come into the proscenium theatres, we have an interesting point made by many scholars, that it becomes the prized visual, prized space for the royalty and the aristocracy, because it really does confirm a central view, which is the best view. And it becomes the appropriate place to play a kind of Baroque allegory of power, or the story of the problems of the small family that are raised themselves to epic proportions, but are not played in epic proportion. It's played in the proscenium arch. So what the proscenium arch, therefore, once it comes in, starts making the change. But again, it's worth remembering that the change really happens once you have gas light and electrical light, because then the hall is no longer illumined, and what is illumined is primarily the playing space. So the social space of of conversation, of having to see who is here, to actually being able to see the king or the queen or the aristocracy in their boxes, that finishes off by the time you get electrics. Side by side, even in the proscenium arch, you have a very prized place, as we all know. The aristocracy, the royalty could sit on stage and watch the performance within the box set. So once again, the box, within the picture frame stage. So what I am suggesting is that the congealment of the picture frame stage comes later, and the fact that it naturalizes a certain kind of expectation of pure, straight, absolutely unobstructed view begins to be acceptable once we have electric lights. I said to you earlier that there is a sense of selective. The spectatorship is selective. The spectator sees what she or he wants to see and what she or he wants to hear. And I'd like to just bring to your attention, and I'm sure you know about this, the quiet theatre movement of Japan, especially by a man called Oriza Hirata, who actually puts on stage several conversations at one time. So there will be 3, 4, 5 conversations happening among people, and you hear which one you want to hear. The rest you obliterate. Now the interesting aspect of the spectatorship experience over there is that you do follow, you can hear, and you make a choice. I want to hear this, I want to hear this, I want to hear this. The rest I don't hear today. Maybe if I come back tomorrow, I will hear that too. Now this ability to actually foreground the fact that there is an intentionality in the in spectatorship, there is an intentionality in viewing as well as an intentionality in seeing, becomes, I think, quite important to foreground, because then the passivity of receiving something straight on to you, particularized as if for you, is shifted. One of the things about the quiet theatre movement in Japan is that one part is that you have 7 conversations, 6 conversations, 5 conversations on the proscenium. The other part is that the major event takes place in the wings. So that what you actually see is not the major event. You only hear the major event, if at all. Like, for instance, he has done a very well-known play on the education system of Japan, and it's set in a classroom, a staff room, where 6, 7 people, groups of people are talking about everything but teaching. So it's about a picnic, it's about cooking, it's about home, and once they leave the stage, the only thing that is that you can hear is a basketball outside. That's all. And that's how it ends. So you're actually then getting 3 kinds of stimulation. One, that you have heard 7 conversations, none of which, or you have heard 1, none of which has had anything to do with teaching. The room empties, and what happens outside is a child playing basketball, probably not under supervision or whatever. So you have made a space which leaks out of the playing area. So most experiments or most intentions of shifting this idea about the proscenium has not necessarily come only via Promenade, but has come via trying to question the way that the proscenium is laid out. Now, one part of the questioning is, of course, as I said to you, visual, and another part of the questioning is also in terms of narrative. And certain narratives, like, let us say, Waiting for Godot, actually tries to question and undermine the spectator's memory. In other words, Godot, Waiting for Godot, will actually be saying to you that we don't know when the play begins, we don't know when the play ends, and is there any escalating narrative, is there an end, is that the beginning? So you undermine any memory. Now this memory aspect, which I will bring up again in a moment, is what also often, it seems to me, makes us expect a certain kind of theatre relationship. How do I look at a play? What do I expect it to come to? In what way do I expect it to come to me? Is also a kind of horizon of expectation. It is a memory of viewing. The past and present recollection of looking at a play determines many times the making of plays. And as Deepan was just now pointing out, what is interesting is that many histories of playmaking get dependent on aligning ourselves to a certain genealogy. This is the way that a certain kind of theatre is done, that is its grammar, And that grammar is the one that is going to decide its form. I think there is a quite interesting and quite, if I might say so, sometimes quite contentious debate about that in present theatre making. It would seem to me that actually it would be possible to say that a theatre like the Promenade Theatre, where you're actually wanting a three-sided experience for the spectator, that it is actually looking at real location, that you're actually wanting the spectator to move, is providing the spectator the opportunity to take on a possible role, not just as a viewer, but also sometimes as an obstructive viewer. And the obstructive viewer seems to me an interesting part of the Promenade. Now, therefore I would suggest to you that the spectatorial relationship in the performance is what actually drives the nature of the performance. In the Ramnagar Ramlila, which is possibly in the form that it is today, started in about the 1870s. It is a promenade theatre. It covers the entire city and has an extremely strong element of memory driving it. In other words, people expect to get to see a certain thing, and whether it is seen or not is not that important as the fact that you expect to see it and therefore you do see it. I would connect this with the fact that in the Ramnagar Ramlila it's very difficult to see and hear at the same time, because there would be an audience of about 15,000 people. So some people who would sit in the absolute edge of performance would see and hear it, the rest would either see or hear. Now, whether that makes a composite experience or whether that makes an experience of one kind of theatre, or are we saying one kind of Ramlila, is never a question. With the viewer, it is the Ramlila. You have seen the Tulsi text enacted and you have not missed anything. Now this is, I think, I would suggest to you an interesting habit of seeing. They will not feel as if I have been instructed. The audience will not feel as if they have been given a role which is not good enough. The hierarchy of viewing is not necessarily in the prime space of interaction. Just as I said that the Ramlila actually inhabits the entire town, the space or its geographical aspects, ponds, rivers, tanks, stand for something else. It's a kind of metonymy. The audience is also ready to take that metonymy, pointing to a pokhar and saying this is the river that Sri Ram crosses, is enough indication to cross it and experience the crossing. Now I think this part of the promenade, where you believe that you're part of a pilgrimage, becomes the making of a relationship. So here in the Ramlila, there are three aspects. While walking maybe 2 kilometers a day, 3-4 kilometers a day, you are a pilgrim, you are part of an endurance test, and you are part of decision making. Now decision making is a thing that has actually now in present circumstances in the theatre has not happened quite as well. Actually there is no decision to make in the proscenium theatre, because once you have sat down, once you have taken the ticket, once you're inside, the decisions have been made for you. With this, I would say to you that the nature of the promenade or walking is one way of actually trying to shift the dominant ways of seeing of the proscenium theatres or theatres that frame the visual for you. The promenade takes it on very much as a kind of marker. How to challenge the dominant experiential model of the theatre, which, as I said to you earlier, is disembodied and atemporal, you find the way of saying you make it embodied and temporal and episodic by moving the audience, to mobilize the spectator actually physically. In the present scenario working, once you actually try to put ambulation or moving as part of the theatre, one of the things that very interestingly both Deepan and I encountered while we were trying to do Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was the fact of whether one should actually find, is there a need to authorize this way of seeing? In other words, is there a need to say Promenade Theatre has a history? And it would seem to me that both he and I, in the process of actually doing the work, tried to think that we ought not to connect up necessarily to say that there is a history of Promenade starting from the medieval times to today, because the viewing nature is in dialogue with the way that the modern theatre has actually represented itself in the proscenium. I just tried to show you three images of the Ramnagar Leela and a few images of Dr. Jekyll for us to have a look at further dialogue. Just see if I can manage that. This is with the Swarups walking, moving faster, walking through the town with the audience and with the figures of the gods on the shoulders so that their feet don't touch the ground. That's the only marker that they are gods. This is the beginning of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These are the gardens of the National School of Drama. All other spaces were found within the campus.
सुना रात की आवाज अंधेरा आओ आओ करता निकले तो लीजिए ये गान बोलिए ना आँख खा पाँव सब लगाइए खोपड़ा खाल उछाल पंडी दस्ताने डालिए जौन निकलती हवा दिसंबर की रात मन तो करता है निकले डर तो लगता है निकले आसमान में तारे जैसे कोई मर गया उसकी चिंधियां खड़े मत रहिए बढ़िए पीछे दीवार है पुरानी विलायती 19वीं सदी आगे अमरूद का पेड़ गुड़हल की झाड़ गमलों के ढेर पैरों के नीचे घास कुचलते चलिए कुचल कुचल हटा हटा कर घुटना वर्जित है ये जगह है प्रवेश द्वार है इस
follow them directly, and the other choice is actually to remain where you are, and when they move to the next room, to follow them. We had to have some discussions when we were working with the students, how much instruction to give. We found that in the beginning, the audience was not immediately willing to move. But once the path got clear, in fact, they sometimes overtook the actors and went to the room to wait. Now, it seems to me that's an interesting point, because why would they want to go before? I think it would be the habit of viewing in the sense that let's find a good seat, rather than thinking that walking in itself is part of the performance. But these were things that we experienced in different days differently. But I'm just bringing it to your attention that that was also some of the feedback as well as the experiential aspect of the play. Then we move to the and the light and follow the actors. So in some senses, we become, in this walk, people who are trying to reach an understanding of what's happening to Dr. Jekyll. So again, in the beginning, the first two performances led us to worry about the fact, once again, that there was a understanding that in this walk between two rooms, the audience was this a blank? Was it a space that's supposed to not connect in their experience? Was it a space that actually was a walkway, that is a street? And when they arrived, did the play begin, the next scene begin, or had it begun as they walked? In the way that the performances progressed, 8 of them, we found that the audience was more used to, the spectator was more used to actually accepting the experience of walking as the days and the performances progressed. So each one, it was hoped that gave a different sense to the scene. Here again, we had to figure out what is the nearest we can have the audience, and so that you can actually look onto the lighted table where they played of planchette. So once again, we are also part of this area. While we drink tea, the three characters play. the drama school that actually made up the narrative. We had over the months improvised on what Dr. Jekyll or what Mr. Hyde would do in their private moments, and in that we found many small things that actually could be incorporated into the narrative, and that was something that Deepan found a space for, as if they were shop windows, as if we were looking into the lives of people in their private spaces, and our voyeurism, as it were, did not affect them. It affected us to ask ourselves why we were looking in. This is the sequence that is this sequence of 4 people doing what they do in their private movement. One is watching the Charlie Chaplin. And then Deepan suggested that why doesn't the scene walk to us? So we have a mobile scene coming in on a truck. This is a projection on one of the, it's not a 1930s set of part of that was Anuradha, but 1950s when this building was part of the USIS, where we put a projection. This is the scene in the truck. Where we actually couldn't see the full sequence, but we could see the whole truck. So we put together what we see of a truck, which looks like a hearse, and inside when it lights up, it looks like a drawing room, but it's the last, as it were, section where you change, you see Hyde who changes into Jekyll, and you have a sense of the mobility of that character and the mobility of ourselves in the viewing. I take you to the last sequence where again the hearse leaves, and as we see the hearse leaving, we hear that there is an event again. The audience is beckoned to a new space. In the first two shows, the audience wouldn't stay. They wouldn't stop. It was not a space that thought was of grieving. And why that was the case was because there was a sign that said, enter here. So the desire to go to the next space overrode the desire to see the scene. Now, I just, for a moment, if I might actually take a slight detour and just put before you that there are many, many exercises in the theatre that now ask the actor to have a soft focus. In other words, not possess the other actor while looking at the person. Let the other actor or the other performer or the viewer have a space. Do not possess the person with the gaze. And it seems to me that this is an important shifting that we might need to understand when we work in the proscenium. There is a possession. Then you possess the actor and the actor possesses you. But probably in the promenade, at least there is a shifting of that question. Complex of theatres, this is the only black box. And this in fact then became the space for doing makeup. So we had 16 actors, 16 makeup mirrors, they were doing a makeup and going through all the rasas of classical drama in the way that they wanted. And so we don't know whether we came to the end was in fact an ambulation to the beginning where they are all prepared, or whether it was the closure of a kind of existential story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'll show you the last. The audience has the choice to stop or not to stop at any of the 17 mirrors. One is that it's a known experience that actors are taught to understand, as well as it's seen as presence of mind, how to grab attention. It's part of the teaching that we do. How do you catch the attention of the audience? So of course there's vocal delivery, there's costume, there's makeup. And there is a wonderful apocryphal story, I believe. I've never found the reference. I found it once many years ago, but I've never found it again. That apparently Ziami, the great father of the No Theatre, said to the actor, if the audience is not looking at you, take an exit, wear a red pajama and enter. And you will have them looking at you. So I have a feeling that at all times, perhaps this notion that you have to possess the audience and the audience has to possess you in one particular way needs to be shifted, and that in fact is one of the long-term projects that I think many of the people that have been part of the projects that we've done together in Diwali, including Nilima here, has been the nature of the attention that you might put on the actor and the nature of the attention you might put on the scenography and indeed on something which is like a painted curtain, so that you actually, the hierarchies of viewing are always up in the air, and you have the choice to decide which way you want to shift that hierarchy in your own experiential journey in the play, and also in the way that the actors are part of that dialogue in which they don't posit a hierarchy of an existential body. Your own experience as an embodied spectator is in dialogue and sometimes even in conflict. That in fact was possibly one of the projects that Deepan and I tried to do in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I'd be very happy if there are any further conversations, but for the moment this is the way that I would like to round off the presentation. Thank you. There's one thing that Deepan wanted, had mentioned that I might want to talk about is what's the nature of experimentation, what's the nature of, in some senses, the dialogues that are happening in contemporary theatre, but perhaps in the course of the discussion, I might find you more to touch on that.
Very formulated question, but I mean, I'm just trying to look at this whole question of viewership and spectatorship that you raised, and the need to, or the need or the impetus to experimentation that arises at wanting to challenge some canon or the other. The relevance of something like that. Now, do you see a difference between, say, cultures? And I don't want to essentialize when I'm saying this, but still, cultures where call and response kinds of spectatorship, or the actor's spectator relationship is intrinsic to, or more natural in certain cultures, where something like this then doesn't then become experimentation necessarily. It's something that is familiar. And something that the audience is really used to, and therefore, so in that kind of a context, if something had to be challenged, then wouldn't the proscenium itself emerge as a challenge? That's the kind of question. I mean, just to take it a bit further, if we look at Brett's alienation, for example, when he's talking about, when he's talking about the social jest and the need for a didactic role of what is happening on stage. Habib Tanveer constantly uses those kinds of techniques from traditional theatre, where the audience's concentration is being, or the emotionality of audience experience is being broken constantly with somebody coming and saying this is what is happening, and so on and so forth. So in that kind of a context, what is the relevance of experimentation when something is more intrinsic to a certain culture?
Well, I mean, I would really, that's a very important question. I would really like to believe that it's intrinsic. But my sense is that it isn't. Because we have had a kind of history of the last, I would say, 50 years, in which the Brechtian structuring, or Habib Sahab's ability and oeuvre, in which you actually are able to set up an audience response and look at it as a political move, not necessarily in the larger scale, which we often teach and say, well, the folk theatre already has alienating devices and it probably equals the same. I don't believe it equals the same. And so I think that should actually have been part of the consciousness of contemporary theatre. But it looks to me, and it seems to me particularly sharp in, let us say, in the region which plays Hindi theatre. Hindi theatre has for some reason taken on the realist mode as being somehow morally more important. And all style is seen as an excess. And all style is also seen as superfluous. So I have a feeling that that debate about the fact that structuration itself is a challenge and proscenium is broken by that. Proscenium doesn't necessarily have to be broken, as you rightly say, by ambulation. But the proscenium can be broken by following different registers of performance. That seems to be actually something that seems, in the last some years, seems less and less part of the discourse around, I'm particularly saying Hindi theatre. Why? It's probably not so the case in some other dramatic forms where there is a habit of stylization. Now, we seem to have forgotten, even within the history of Hindi theatre, that Bharatendu Harishchandra, using Andher Nagari, using that text as an example, uses the resources of Parsi theatre, for instance, which is a completely negated form in the histories and genealogies of Hindi theatre. It's negated because it seems to be of mixed parentage. It has supposedly a proscenium arch narrative. Now, it looks to me that's why perhaps we have to not, it's the relevance is to talk about the fact that there is different experiences and that there is not a dominant mode of yoga. And that dominant mode is not connected to a certain kind of psychological realism that we believe somehow has got connected to Indian modernity. And I think that argument would be something that might be looked at. And just to say again that I think that the 1970s, where the structure of plays was itself an argument, which for instance Habib Sahab has brought up, that structure of playing and the structure of alienation seems to have been absorbed into the idea that we always had it. And I think that is something that we really need to read again, and sometimes read against the grain.
I'd like to two questions, maybe they are related. One is this aspect of how the audience, the viewers' participation. How actually the participation is different in Promenade Theatre and in proscenium theatre. And all other variations of theatre, which is traditional. I mean, this form of theatre seems to offer a greater possibility for audience to use that role as audience and become actors. Because that aspect is very interesting for me. To see that audience themselves are also, especially in the videos, it's very clear, that they are actually also participating in the play with their own body movements and their trepidation or doubts or their anxiety, so many expressions that pass through, so emotions that pass through, curiosity included, and a certain inability to also grasp it fully, that's also there. So how, is it consciously kind of thought about in terms of participation? That's one question. Second is probably related to this. There is a certain hardness of the theme that do not easily allow a participation. Probably, I have been also thinking, since I saw this production, I was also thinking it may be because the play itself is somewhat removed from our context. Although philosophically it may be very much rooted in a universal experience, in human experience, but these are not relatable things as far as lived contexts are concerned. Right? So these
let me start with the first one. Participation or participatory theatre has, there has been there's a lot of talk and lot of experimentation, lots of desire connected to it. That you actually have a spectator that is more in relation to you and to the story you want to tell. But there is a very thin line in how we might talk about participation in a ritual and participation in a, let's say, a play that might happen now. Now, I think that what is interesting, and that perhaps relates to the second question, what is interesting is that there could be and might actually be built into the play the space of saying no. This doesn't interest me. And, or saying, I don't mind if I don't see it. Or saying, like you said, the anxiety seems to have come forth a lot in the last sequence, where they were all making up a great deal of anxiety about yourself. Are you a voyeur? Are you in a space you shouldn't be? And I think that option of actually walking out may be really put. And it's an option not saying I don't like the play, but I don't want the sequence. So I have a feeling that perhaps one may actually argue from that point to say that ritual participation is for me. When I am participating in a ritual performance or I'm even viewing, it is for me. In some ways it is going to produce something which might affect me. Now this, in the modern play, that's not the case. It has nothing in some senses to do with my existential being. It's not going to do anything for me, other than the fact that it might give me an experience beyond the everyday. Related to that, and it's again related to the first part I'm saying, is the expectation of the theatre-going audience in today's in today's metropolis, but I would say even in small towns, is very much to do with the fact that it doesn't come near me. It's there. It's far. There's a wall. Not the fourth wall, but there's a wall. This is a hallowed space. This is sacred space, even if it is kind of secular illusion. I think that might be the import. That you don't have to possess the artwork in that particular way, or you don't have it, let it possess you. Now I have a feeling that the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde story, one of the arguments we had through while improvising on it was that it very quickly goes into an existential mode. It is, very quickly questions the true and the false and the real and the fantastical, etc. Not even necessarily in the Gothic frame. It quickly goes into the fact of what is my true self, or is there a true self? And I think that could be something that doesn't necessarily put a glass wall between the audience and the actor. But I wanted to just put a personal detail. I was quite concerned that the only itinerary through the play should not be one about the condition of the human being. That there is a truth and then there is an untruth. That it should be a little more other than the condition of the human being, because then we have, this is too general and too hospitable an experience in the sense that every play in that sense will be telling you about what a creature is man, So in that way, some of the obscurity of the text perhaps helped in deflecting it, but that's also mine. It could actually be seen as something that kept the audience in a space which was didn't relate. I think it could be possible, but I don't know whether this actually answers the question. But these were some of the thoughts that we did work with at that. Question.
wanted to understand this promenade performance and its concept at its root. And just like you were just mentioning the existential aspects about this performance and the concept. So, and you're talking about how it's necessary kind of to have the audience's attention. And so I saw the play and I saw it months ago, and I felt like it was delving on a lot of evil, so-called evil aspects of the character. And what does it do to the spectatorship? Is the spectator very interested, or it's, or I can say that the play is specifically depending on the voyeuristic tendencies of the spectator. So it does not. The play basically does not talk about what is the good nature of Dr. Jekyll. It is primarily exploring and re-exploring those when there's a scene he's masturbating, he's trying to do a mask on himself, he's kind of doing those kinds of seemingly grotesque kind of actions. But what is the other aspect? So that kind of balance was not there. Probably, and then if you're trying to, when you just mentioned that it's necessary to have the spectator in your confidence in kind of that, spectator. So does the spectator is there because of its voyeuristic tendencies? So I'm just trying to understand.
I think the voyeurism. By putting the play as a promenade performance, I think that one of the ideas that we were trying to explore was to have, let us say, the sense of voyeurism, but also to walk out of it. If this was, let us say, in a closed room, if every performance, every sequence was in a closed room, there was no option but to actually deal primarily with voyeurism. I would also think that, I'm not sure whether we were successful, but maybe people might want to come in there. I think that there was different kinds of voyeurism to every play, to every section. In the closed room, there is another kind of, in the photographic lab, when the red sequence, there is no voyeurism because you are in the lab. When you're talking, when there is a kind of divided sequence between Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde in a strange kind of grotesque, dealing with a rag doll and his staff working downstairs. There was, in fact, it had a split, so that you seem to be part, you could have been sitting in the park, then this could have been happening. Because there was a blind that was actually covering one part of Hyde's place. The seance was absolutely out of the open. And the death was in a shut room. So there would be very many kinds of viewing. Now, as far as voyeurism with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is concerned, I think the text in itself leads you to that. You're trying to look inside somebody. You're trying to see what was that potion that he drank which turned him inside out. So there is some voyeurism written in. But I would say what is interesting in the Gothic tradition would be just this, that the voyeurism is, the evil has several registers. And the death, the blood-sucking, the evil, the vampires, all that have very many registers. And they don't necessarily have to attend to the good and evil in the man. And the last question, that there was more evil than good, that's the old story about Satan being more interesting than God. I think that as actors, the major improvisation always came on Hyde.
So probably Dr. Jekyll was not good in any way. I mean, he probably was that. He was probably evil and he just wanted to invent
or let us say that there was too small a quotient to good. It was taken over by evil. No, but I think that it is somewhere about performance, and it seems to me that the hidden life, the hidden evil, is something that the actors responded to enormously in trying to uncover. And I think that we had the good fortune of working with Gitanjali, who was looking at the improvisation and providing the text. So that let's say that dip or bend towards the evil is possibly somewhere there. But I also want to say to you that perhaps when you look at the novel, Dr. Jekyll is more talked about than seen. It's Hyde who's rampaging through London. So, so there also there is that.
I just want to ask three short questions. Maybe the third question is something related to Sinji's question. The first question in your speech you were just talking about the real spaces in the Promenade performance. What the real spaces mean? I mean, it's the created spaces or it's natural spaces? Yes. The second question is, what according to you Ramnagar's Lamlila is a ritualistic performance, is a ritual or a performance? And the third thing is, when you are talking about the viewership, more communicating to the viewer, in your production that Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, is you find enough participation with the audience? Or, I mean, on the participation level, it will succeed what you thought, before the production. Because if we talk about these kinds of prominent performances, could not be done. I mean, ordinary.
Each space is already in existing living spaces, and it's not really constructed, especially for this play. So, for example, the lab room is very small space where you cannot have more than 30 people there. Or practicing, workshop space. And the only space where we can take more people was the last room, and then open garden, open lawn space. So the idea was to have only 30 people. There was only 30 people.